And good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you all. I think the cameras should be on in a moment. Becky's activating it. And just whilst we're waiting, allow me to introduce our very special guest, and I'm delighted to welcome Sir Richard Barrons KCB, CBE, former commander of the Joint Forces Command and co-chairman of the Universal Defence and Security Solutions Limited. Sir Richard, we are delighted you're with us, and a huge congratulations on your appointment the day before yesterday by the Prime Minister to the team leading our strategic defence review. We are delighted you're with us, and I recognise that appointment means there are certain things you may be unable to talk about today, but we are delighted you are with us to share your perspective. So thank you ever so much for joining, and welcome to all of our guests. And before we get started, maybe a little bit of housekeeping, if I may. Please do be on mute, and do turn on your cameras if you can, so that we can see that we're not just talking into a void. We have got time planned for Q&A at the end, so please do fire in any questions that you may have, and Sir Richard, I'm sure, will be delighted to pick them up. So what are we doing today? We are discussing geopolitics, defence, and the implications for the broader economy and financial services. And of course, this is all being done against a particularly challenging backdrop. We've just had the 75th NATO summit take place in Washington last week. And whilst it feels much has happened since then, the summit itself obviously culminated in what was largely anticipated. So increased commitments of defence spending, further support for Ukraine. But we're also meeting at a significant time of change and perhaps unrest. And it's difficult to start this session without anything other than the shocking and regrettably unsurprising scenes that we saw in Pennsylvania over the weekend. And of course, our condolences to those killed and their families. And of course, we are thankful that former President Trump's injuries were not more serious. How all of this now plays out remains unclear. And whilst the US has, of course, taken the headlines over the last few weeks, we shouldn't miss that there have been a large number of elections in lots of other profile locations, from South Africa to Mexico, India, Iran, the European parliamentary elections, France, and of course, the UK. And we've seen that the results of these elections have not entirely played out as predicted. And even when the favourites have won, it hasn't been by the majority that the pollsters had suggested. And lots of conclusions can be drawn from this, and Sir Richard and I were talking about this just yesterday. But what is clear is that there is obviously a backlash against incumbency. And secondly, even when the election results have tended towards the favourites, there have still been surprises. And when we turn to the macroeconomics and how geopolitics is playing against that, it is clear that we have not had the economic hard landing globally that many had feared, perhaps this time last year. But what has definitely hardened in recent months is the geopolitical uncertainty, supply chain tensions, and the hot, cold, and trade wars that are starting to play out around us. And this volatility and political uncertainty means the financial services and professional services companies would continue to operate in a state of perpetual flux. And Sir Richard has agreed to share some perspectives on all of the above and maybe some other things. And so what we thought we would do is give Sir Richard the floor with some opening remarks, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So with that, Sir Richard, perhaps over to you.
So, Omar, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Really grateful for this opportunity to talk to such a distinguished gathering. I'm going to start with the NATO summit as requested, and then move on there to talk about the sort of broader issues around security and in a much more challenging world. And I hope you'll find there's a thread in there, which is it really is getting more difficult. But let me start with the NATO summit. As Omar said, there've been a lot of summits. There's ideally one a year, and NATO is by far the most successful military alliance in the history of mankind, and largely thanks to the US, also the most powerful. And it's been around 75 years. And so it's acquired a sense of permanence, despite the fact that the reason for having NATO and what it has to do keeps changing. And that was clearly reflected in the conversations in the summit, which of course are meant to portray tremendous unity. But if you just look a little bit below the surface, you can see there are some very significant tensions and pressures on the alliance. And the summit really only had to do two jobs. It had to decide what the alliance is going to do to support Ukraine. We'll talk a bit more about that. And it had to decide what the alliance is going to do in the face of this much more difficult world. And let's start with Ukraine, because in many ways it's the leading symptom of the tensions the alliance is having to wrestle with. The ask from the Secretary General, whose last summit this was for $100 billion over 2 years to support Ukraine. And just as a rule of thumb, the war costs Ukraine about $50 billion a year in warlike stuff, and about the same in running a country originally of 40 odd million people. And it's not a wealthy place, one of the poorer countries in the world, in fact. And what Ukraine walked away with was $40 billion for a year. And this absolutely reflects US politics, where, as you know, major election coming up. And you will have watched the very challenging debate in Congress and the Senate over the first half of this year about the $60 billion package of military aid that is now going to Ukraine. But there was an 8-month delay in that being agreed. So on the one hand, for the alliance, it is clear to most, but not all of the members, that a good outcome in Ukraine, however you want to define it, and there are many definitions, is important to the security of the alliance, both in terms of the physical security of the alliance area, but also the place of the alliance in global affairs, which is always a code for, in a conversation with China in a century which is dominated by the rise of Asia. And underlying that, there is the certainty that more of this bill is going to come to Europe, because in US politics, there is a gathering sense that this is more now a European problem. And beyond that, the US has very different security interests, which we'll talk a bit more about. So in the context of Ukraine, there currently is no doubt that the alliance will see this war through well into next year, and then really doesn't expect to falter, but it is aiming off for much less US help. And you can all see why that might be different depending on the outcome of the election. The second thing the alliance had to do was to decide what it's really going to do to revitalize itself on the back of the threat posed, of course, by Russia, but actually a developing sense of a much more challenging world more broadly. And NATO decided 4 years ago that it would move to reset what's called deterrence by denial rather than deterrence by punishment. And the definition of that doesn't matter a whole lot, save that deterrence by denial is more expensive because you have to have more forces more ready all the time, in a way that you didn't have to during the post-Cold War era. But what was really interesting in this particular summit was, of course, there was a conversation about what the alliance needs to do about Russia. And that's Russia in the face of the confrontation with Ukraine. But secondly, and really for the first time, this bigger acknowledgement that when NATO or the West looks at a more troubled world, it's beginning to characterize that trouble as facing a bloc rather than Russia or China. And the bloc is becoming led by China, but with Russia, North Korea, and Iran as the confrontations and conflicts around those particular powers are beginning to coalesce, and those four powers are beginning to organize themselves better. So previously, we might have talked about a clash between liberal democracy led by the US and autocratic capitalism led by China. And the difference this year, I think, is a greater sense that the world has two blocks, led by the US and led by China, and an awful lot of the world is looking on in Africa and Asia, wondering if it has to choose, not at all sure it wants to, and not at all sure it would choose the West if it really has to. The alliance has never been in that place before. And then underpinning all of that, there is this big strategic recognition that the armed forces of NATO and the countries that they secure are in the condition they are in as a result of the journey traveled over 30 years of the post-Cold War era. And that's over. And I can explain why the armed forces in the UK and elsewhere are the size, shape, and readiness that they are. And then I'm also able to explain why that is going to fall very far short of the armed forces you need for the world we now live in, which is increasingly characterized less as post-war and as, in some not terribly well-defined way, pre-war, which I think is a better description. And with that are coming a number of challenges. One is money, because if you ask the NATO planners how much of a GDP they would like from every member in order to reset capability to deal with the challenges that the members have set the alliance leadership, it's about 3.5 or 4% of GDP, and very few people want to make that. If you ask the UK government how much they want to spend on defence, they'll wince and they'll say 2.5% of GDP when we can afford it. And that in itself is a difficult place for any government to be, because if you say on the one hand, the world is changing, we can't afford to ignore it, it's quite hard then to say, but we can't afford to do anything about it, because actually you're just dodging some really difficult choices. And the fact is many NATO members are backmarking at about the 1.4, 1.5% of GDP. But there's a lot more to this conversation, because the first point is in an era where we've returned to existential peril to security and prosperity and values, we're being reminded, and this is where the city is so important, that war or confrontation between states is a whole of society undertaking. And yet the default setting in civil society, our politics, and in many other quarters of our life is that war is somehow a thing you outsource to armed forces, like you did in the post-Cold War era. But that's not the case today. And if you look at the experience of Ukraine, you can see it touches every corner of society, which is why a conversation in the city and in industry about what confrontation and conflict means is so important, because we're all on the pitch now. And indeed, in many ways, people like me in the armed forces, we're not the objective, we're not the target. It's industry and civil society are the target, because that's where the will to resist or not to resist flows from. And the second thing that's really important in this time is when we talk about resetting defense, we are, of course, talking about it in the digital age, and defense and security going through the most profound transformation of how you do that for 150 years as the digital age drives that transformation. And so that's the reverse of, say, the Second World War, where military innovation drove how you developed armed forces, and then that innovation bled back into civil society. It's not the case now. All the tech, cloud, AI, robotics, autonomy, bioscience is coming from the civil sector and will be applied into different militaries. And that is where the competitive advantage lies. And everybody is groping for a better and affordable answer, including the UK, including in the review that is now underway. And the final thing I want to say before I shut up is when we think about risk in our world, and NATO has broadly got this, it just hasn't got the solutions, is that there's some aspects that are not new, great power confrontation. And then there are other aspects that really are new. We've never had this sort of conversation between blocs on a tableau which will be, in many cases, determined by the instability created by population growth and climate change, where known effects are going to unseat entire countries and relationships between countries. And we've never done that in parallel with the general transformation of the digital age. And we've never done that in parallel with a world where, yes, we've had nuclear weapons, but now we live in an age where some people think a small tactical nuclear weapon is a reasonable thing to use if the situation is dire enough. We've shied away from that since the Second World War, but it's very firmly in our sights now. So I'm going to stop there by saying, if you look at the NATO summit and you look at what it had to deal with, underneath it is this reminder that we live in an age of existential risk, which is a whole of society undertaking. And in that context, city and industry are as much a player and as much a target as the armed forces. Back to Omar.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sir Richard. Maybe let's stay with where you ended, and that we've got questions coming in from colleagues on the call. Please do continue to fire them in, as Richard has agreed to take as many as he can. But let me kick us off with one. You touched on difficult choices, and given events in the US, and perhaps you could just share some reflections on what a Trump presidency may mean for NATO and what it might mean in terms of the difficult choices it presents for the UK, Europe, and other members of the alliance.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the first thing is, common to all outcomes from this US election is the fact that for more than 10 years, the US has been saying very clearly that it is no longer going to make the sort of contribution to European security it's made since 1947. And the US currently picks up 70% of the total defense spending of NATO. And the US has been saying, look, that worked in 1947 when the European economies were basically broken. But now a US economy of about 23.5 trillion GDP a year and a European economy of around 17.5 trillion GDP a year, you know, that doesn't work for us anymore. And by the way, also, if you're in the US, our primary concern is China. It's not Europe now. And you can see that in the Ukraine debate. Secondly, our debt to GDP ratio is knocking around 100%. And so this bill is enormous and we need to make it smaller. And thirdly, we're spending on things like our border problems, but we're looking at the fence at you in Europe, and you are spending a lot of money on health and welfare and education, stuff that we don't get in the US. And it feels like we're bailing out your security. We're not going to do that anymore. I mean, Biden has been saying that for 10 years. The issue with Mr. Trump is he's just way more unpredictable. And I'm not even sure he knows what he's really going to do on Ukraine or NATO. But the uncertainty is really daunting. So on the one hand, I think we can factor in a much bigger bill for defense and security is coming to Europe in all outcomes. It's just the speed and the tempo that might be in doubt. And the unfortunate thing for Europe is that bill is going to arrive just as the bill has got much bigger because of the world that we live in and because of the state of armed forces on the back of the post-Cold War era. And it is electoral suicide for any politician to talk in those terms, because it actually means really hard choices about, I mean, not more taxes and borrowing because we're a bit maxed out on that, but on having a lot less of things we really are used to having in order to do defense better in collective security, which remains a pay to play. It's just really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to you, so you're saying irrespective of what decision a potential President Trump may make about the US continuing with the NATO alliance, we're in for greater defense spending. And do you see in that situation, if the US were to withdraw from NATO, the alliance surviving that?
So Europe only survives with a collective security arrangement. No state in Europe is big enough or or good enough to foot the bill for independent security. So we're committed to collective security. It's a sensible thing to do. But we fell into a habit of thinking that meant that the US would pay mostly for our collective security. And it's not going to do that as richly. I like to think that this will be a change over time rather than a than a cliff edge. And we need to recognize there are some things the US does for NATO that only the US has in terms of some intelligence capability, strategic command and control, strategic logistics, ballistic missile defense, that kind of thing. And so if the US withdraws that, and let's hope it doesn't do that quickly, if you want to reproduce that as a band of brothers within Europe in an arrangement, it's expensive. So a rule of thumb, we really don't have any air and missile defense of even London. And putting that right, rough rule of thumb, about £4 billion, none of which is currently in defense.
Understood. One alliance that we haven't touched on, I wouldn't mind if it'd be great if you share some perspectives, is the recently formed Orcus. And whilst NATO has been in the crosshairs, that hasn't really been talked about. I wonder if you could share some reflections on what could be the prognosis for that.
Yeah, the strategic case for Orcus is really, in my view, compelling because it's part of the response to how the UK recognizes in a world where the power is shifting to Asia, and as a country that relies on frankly our friends and our enemies for half our food and half our energy and our trading existence, that we can't become isolationists. So AUKUS is a way of binding together with like-minded parties in Asia in a different sort of collective security arrangement. There's no Article 5 that would cause us to fight. And there's a really important part, Pillar 1, which is about key submarine technology, to which there's a huge amount of money attached. And for my mind, the much more important bit is actually Pillar 2, which is about technology. And this is where there are two opportunities. One is to bind with partners to develop really expensive technology very quickly and to build interoperability on that basis. And the other, just as important, is if you're good at innovation, and the UK should be good at innovation, including investing in innovation, it gives you access to a big market of like-minded people all sharing the same fears and concerns. So we should see it as an aspect of collective security. And there are judgments to be made for the military about where force elements like ships go. And in my view, more of that will end up in the North Atlantic and Europe for now. But the technology argument, common to all outcomes, and a major driver for the UK, in my view.
Yeah. Thank you, Sir Richard. We've just had a question come in from one of the participants who's asked, are you expecting anything to come out of the meeting between the UK and the EU tomorrow? I think it's been referred to as the Blenheim Summit on defence. Are we expecting anything post-NATO to come out of those discussions?
So I don't think we're expecting very much, partly because we've just had the NATO summit, and the UK's collective defence and security is run through NATO. The other aspect of this, however, is if you think of confrontation and conflict as a whole of society, all levers of power undertaking, NATO is a military instrument. It does that really well. And the EU is a remarkable thing in that it's economically very powerful. And alone amongst such blocs in the world, it chooses not to align, frankly, military, political or military power with its economic weight. But somehow we have to find a way of aligning NATO's military power with Europe's economic and social power. And the UK, because geography hasn't changed, really needs to be part of that. And we all know how difficult it is to have that discussion on the back of, the difficult Brexit journey. But there has got to be a leaning towards each other, in my view, in our own interests. It's just difficult to define what that leaning in looks like.
Yeah. We've got another question come in. So recognising that you talked about increasing defence spending, so that won't all just be hardware and machinery and so on, it'll be people. We've got a question coming in saying, with labour and skills shortages across all sectors, how do we increase recruitment into the armed forces?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and it's really hard to solve because the answer is in a lot more than money. In my view, the first thing is when defense looks at what it has to do, what capability it needs, it's going to have to break out of trying to meet that bill by hiring more regular soldiers, sailors, airmen, and marines. It's going to have to look at a mix of regular, of course, but only for the things that you do all the time or at high readiness or are about mobilization. There's a much bigger play in reserves because you can tap into wider talent in civil society. It's much cheaper to own. It's no cheaper when you use it, but a big, healthy reserve, which you don't have right now, much cheaper to own. So regular reserve, of course, civil servant, and then industry. So there's a different approach to the manpower mix when you think about how you restore mass and endurance to armed forces. And the second aspect, just as important, and I think harder to do, a bit slower, is about man machine teaming. And all armed forces in the world are on a journey from a design which is about people manning platforms like ships, tanks, aircraft, into a mix which is those things, still people manning platforms, including protected platforms, but unmanned, which is what a drone is. Someone is driving it from afar, and increasingly autonomous. And so in the air, at sea, under the sea, and on land, where you might have seen one thing with people on it, you're already beginning to see two others conforming to it that have nobody on it, the loyal wingman concept. Easier to do in the air and at sea, but coming quite quickly on land. So part of the answer to how you restore mass and endurance in a battle for talent is by a different mix and through man-machine teaming. And then the armed forces are going to have to be financially competitive enough. So, for example, if you join the army now as a recruit, you're invited to be paid less than the minimum wage for the 6 months that you're training. And when you've done 6 months training, you might get the minimum wage. And the youth of today are pointing out they can do better.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, yeah, and I'm guessing some of this will feature in the upcoming strategic defence review. And this may be a neat segue, Sir Richard, if I may, into that. That was the strategic defence review that was announced 2 days ago by the Prime Minister. It would be useful just, and I recognise there are certain things obviously you cannot talk about, but it'd be helpful maybe just to share some of your perspectives of what you think the exam questions are that you and colleagues. I understand General Lord Robertson is working alongside you on it. The types of questions and objectives of the review and what we should expect to see. And then again, you touched on the role of the city and civil society and what we may anticipate may be some answers as well.
So I'm happy to talk about the challenge. I don't know what the outcomes yet. This is actually day 3 still. So in terms of the challenge, well, it touches on the world we've described already, which is we've arrived in this era of existential risk and peril. We'll call it pre-war. We've arrived at that point with the armed forces that we've ended up with at the end of the post-Cold War. So there's a gap. And we've arrived at that point when technology is going to transform how you do defense and security anyway. So there's a conversation to be had about, well, what should the armed forces do in this world? What are their roles? And therefore, what capabilities do they need to fulfill those roles? And how do they match across to what you have now? And this is always a difficult thing for any armed forces in the world. Armed forces generally only change historically when they've been defeated or when politics makes them change. They're naturally conservative, slow moving, and inclined to want to be a slightly bigger, better version of the thing they are now or remember being quite recently. And that isn't going to work in this world. We're in an era of transformation. But for the armed forces, that transformation has got to recognize war as a whole of society effort. So the relationship with civil society, which is about people and skills, and industry and the city, will be an important part of the review, because you can't build an answer to this world without building that sort of holistic approach, because war is much more about what the military do. There's the military work, there's the sub-threshold confrontation that goes on every day in cyberspace and in the assault on what we think through social media, that kind of thing. So it's quite difficult to put a boundary to it. And then there are some bits which, if you're going to look at defence, as it were, from soup to nuts, are then they're not where the eye falls first, because the eye falls first on army, navies, and air forces. But the eye in this review is going to have to fall on how you make technology choices. So what are the bets that work in this application I talked about? How do you do acquisition in a way that delivers value for money? Because you can't buy software-defined capability in the way you bought a battleship. And actually, no one's trying to do that. But if it takes 1,300 days to get a big program from first thought to some sort of signature, that's not going to work in the world that we live in. And within defence, there are big questions about what sort of financial and administrative bureaucracy that you need, because I think unarguably there is scope for reform there to make the thing lean and efficient and agile. So if you bundle all of that together, what we need to do in this review is to work out what we need our defence force, our armed forces, to do with allies, and what's the best way of doing that and sustaining it. And there is nothing off limits.
Interesting. Thank you. And thank you for being as open as you can be. And as part of nothing off limits, of course, our industry suffers a huge amount from the implications of, some would say, we're not in pre-war, we're definitely in a Cold War, and the number of cyber attacks impacting the financial services sector continue to rise. And some of the numbers I have seen on that recently are frightening. Will the review be broad in that context, so cover off the non-military side and some of the areas that we are also suffering from at the moment in terms of sanctions and cybersecurity risks and so on?
So in the context of this review at this time, it's very focused on fixing defence. The boundary between fixing defence and the wider aspects of societal and economic resilience, it's quite difficult to define, so it's bound to get into that. So, for example, the armed forces have a vested interest in how technology that is being developed in industry and in the city, and IPR is clearly ending up in China when it shouldn't. The military have a very profound interest in the resilience of the supply chains to the military, but that's a much smaller part of overall manufacturing supply chain resilience. So I think this review will only go so far down that road, and it'll be conditioned by, well, what is it we need to do for the armed forces? It will absolutely flash up the conversation that needs to follow hard behind it in a wider national context about how do you make UK resilient in a world where if you look at the UK as a target, you might worry about the armed forces, but actually you're going to worry about the city and critical national infrastructure and key manufacturing and social media resilience. Those are much richer targets. And the armed forces can never protect all of that. They'll just do their thing.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, just to your point, organizations over the last 2 years in particular have been going through a process of reshoring, bringing back bits of the supply chain to the UK or other solid allies. But the idea that we have a trade and industrial strategy that is pre-war at this stage, it doesn't feel as though we do. And at the moment, so you're saying that your review will not go that far, and then we're expecting the government to run alongside that with. So
I think there are bits that defence will need to think about. So as you know well, the UK economy relies on the cables that bring information to and from our shores. And our enemies know this perfectly well. So one of the conversations in the review is, what is it the defence needs to do to improve the resilience of that connectivity? And defence can come to a conclusion about that, but it's only going to be a part conclusion. So I suspect where the review will end up is it will do what it's been asked to do, and it will then highlight these questions more clearly to a new government, and they'll then form part of a wider conversation about national security. And I think this is because this is a very broad and difficult arena in the round, and this government knows it needs to fix defence anyway quickly, but it knows this why the debate is coming. And I think what I and my fellow reviewers are going to do will set the scene for that. But we're absolutely not asked to cover the whole waterfront.
And so, Richard, I hope you don't mind me going here, but some might argue that we are talking up potentially the risk of war and us being drawn into war here, particularly as we go through a defence review and budgets are likely to increase on the back of it. What would you say to that? Is there a risk that we're talking this up too much?
So I start in a slightly different place, which is we need to look at the cost of the failure of deterrence. So if you look at what we're seeing in Ukraine, $500 billion worth of damage to Ukraine already, at least 500,000 Russian men killed and wounded, and the prospect of maybe another 1.8 million Russian casualties before this war comes to a conclusion. These are enormous figures. All of that was avoidable if Ukraine, with NATO, had deterred Russia from thinking it could do this, and we didn't do a good enough job. So a conversation about the military must first and foremost be about how you reset deterrence. Now, deterrence, I did 10 years in the Cold War. It's pretty boring a lot of the time. It's a way better answer than being vulnerable and being taken advantage of. So this conversation about resetting defense will be about how you do deterrence, full spectrum, well enough to deter war, whether it's with Russia, which right now is frankly an easier challenge to contemplate than worrying about how we find an accommodation with China as China asserts itself in the war over the rest of this century. And everybody should recognize that we've all failed if we end up having to fight. But we should also recognize it's part of the human condition when you feel squeezed enough to fight, almost regardless of the consequences. Again, look at what's happening in Ukraine. And as a lifelong soldier, I should absolutely say we're never going to be in a place where the military get to choose whether you fight or not. That's a really bad place to be. The military's job is to make sure that they tell you what's required and then do it well. And we lead with deterrence.
Very powerful. Thank you. We've got some other questions coming in, and maybe just picking up on that theme that you shared earlier about civil society and the city. We've also heard the Prime Minister and the Chancellor talk pre-election and subsequent about the need for the private sector and the public sector to work more closely together. Do you see that translating to the world of defence? And if so, what role would you envisage for the city in that?
So I'm really pleased you've asked that question, because in writing the terms for the review, I and others have made sure that is central to it. So we have a government now that is very focused on growth, and it's very focused on how the money it spends on defence is attached to UK prosperity, and it sees that as partly about things you do in the UK and partly about how we grow an export industry. And the great opportunity here for everybody is we have to fix defence. We've got to restore deterrence and our ability to fight if called upon. And the big answer to that is in transformation and modernisation. And most of that technology and some of the method all sits in the city and in industry and civil society. So we need that conversation to drive transformation. And secondly, get the transformation right will lower the cost of defence on a sustainable basis, because we will have seized all the advantages that you get with digital transformation, rather than clinging to some quite analog ways of equipping and operating. And when we do that, if we do it first in the UK and the review is a vehicle for that, we will alight on technology and ways of working that our partners in NATO and more broadly will be really interested in. And this might be in how you use AI in military decision making. It might be how advanced synthetic environments play into how you do military command and control, and indeed logistics. It's definitely going to be in how you combine connectivity, robotics, and autonomy to produce this manned, unmanned, autonomous team. Unlike perhaps building a very expensive frigate at about £1 billion, we would need to start making stuff which is good for the British Armed Forces and easily exportable. And Orcus then becomes part of that. And because some of this technology is dual use, so a drone is very dual use technology, we need to turn to the city to drive the right investment with that export potential in mind. It is beyond the capacity or frankly the competence of government to do some of that well enough. So we need to find investment pathways and manufacturing opportunities that solve the defense problem, but also solve the prosperity and growth problem.
Yeah.
And there's absolutely no way the Ministry of Defence knows how to do that.
Yeah, which is interesting. I mean, obviously you talked about that earlier on in your remarks. Given the history of the innovation for military defence, you would kind of anticipate some would come from that. But just sticking with the theme, if I may. So if the expectation is more comes from the private sector in terms of advanced technologies that are going to be used by the military, of course, a lot of the componentry and natural resources and minerals don't exist within our shores, and we are relying on others for them. Do you anticipate then a more interventionist trade and industrial policy?
So I think there's going to be a very vibrant conversation about how we assure, how we secure, and how we prosper. And as we talked about at the start, because the UK is a big, but not one of the biggest economic players and operates as part of a connected world, there is no drawbridge to pull up and survive and thrive. You have to go and be part of this world. And one of the challenges for defense here is, if you think about the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and of that time, they were of a type. They were discretionary interventions. They didn't touch on vital national interests, really. They didn't have any consequences for the domestic economy. They didn't require mobilization. They didn't bring any peril. But if we live in a world where we can imagine not having enough food, energy, vital materials to sustain our life, then everybody's going to feel differently about that. And with our partners, we will have to assure security of supply of vital things. Now, that might mean stockpiling. That's an easier solution. But in some settings, I fear we're moving into a world where people will be more assertive about how they protect their interests if dialogue has broken down. And that's a very uncomfortable conversation to have in the UK in 2024 on the back of 30 years of post-Cold War era and this sense of a prosperous and largely pain-free life. But the world has moved on from that, and we don't really get to choose how it turns out now. Yeah.
Well, that's a scary prospect on what is a semi-sunny Wednesday afternoon in London. We've got all parts of the city on this call, from wealth and asset managers, investment banks, and looking at retail and commercial banks, insurers, lawyers, accountants, consultants. I'd just be interested in, if you were sat talking to the boards of these various companies, what sort of advice would you be giving them right now? And I preface this with many are currently considering, as I say, changes to their own operating model. Our supply chains are different to manufacturing, but if you were to call it a supply chain, there's a lot of movement happening. Some are thinking about how they operate in certain geographies. Some have had to withdraw from certain geographies as a consequence of sanctions and other overt geopolitical forces. What would you be saying that boards should be considering and looking out for over the next few years, and how should boards be equipping themselves right now?
So I think the first thing is, we've talked about a different and much harder, darker, uncertain and challenging world. And that's not a world many boards have a lot of experience of managing, because we've had a pretty comfortable ride for a generation, maybe longer than that. So I think the first thing is for all boards is they have to understand that this world is turning out like it is. We didn't ask for it, but we can't ignore it. And and you can't assume immunity from it, or some sort of guarantee of freedom from harm. So boards need to think differently about the strategic horizon. And then, frankly, unlike some governments in the run-up to the war in Ukraine, once you've got your head around that, you actually have to take some decisions to assure the prospects and continuity of your enterprise. You can't hope that it goes away, and that requires leadership, and it requires decisions. And many of those decisions are going to be about resilience. And we talked about cyber resilience, and that's an easy conversation to start with. But most enterprises in the city understand well there isn't a government body that protects their data and their networks and trains and holds their people to account for cyber. They have to do that themselves, or they just make themselves a target. It's going to be the same in supply chain resilience, where if you don't understand, perhaps right to the lowest level of how the bits that come into a manufacturing business or connect an enterprise up is how they fit together and who owns which bit, then in a world where confrontation is expressed through economic means like sanctions as much as it is by physical means like the armed forces, then you make yourself vulnerable and you are not ready to deal with a crisis. So understanding, owning, and assuring supply chain resilience, I think is fantastically important. And then there is this third element, which in the world we live in, people like me, slayers of nations, we understand we can do some physical things, but the great thing is every adult in my own and my opponent's population is basically connected to the internet now. And so I can tell them what I want them to know or understand, can make them feel differently about things. And it's that cognitive resilience that becomes really at issue, because war is about will. And therefore, if companies have got people who are confident and secured and well-led and well-motivated, they'll ride out a crisis. If they're none of those things, then even if you've got great systems, your people will fall away. And in that setting, and perhaps going an order of magnitude down, there are two things that seem to set companies that are resilient apart from those that are not. And the first is the senior leadership drives training and preparation. They have exercised when their network is breached. They have exercised when their supply chain is taken down at some remote part, such as the Suez Canal. And the second thing they have is they have a comms plan. And as soon as it's gone wrong, the CEO launches this thing. He owns it. He or she owns it, and they've taken charge of the drama. I mean, governments and armed forces try to do that. It's not second nature in many in many businesses. So my first big point is please do all of those things, because the world identifies that you're a target if you don't, an easier target. And the second thing is we really need investment and innovation and talent to lean into the armed forces. The armed forces are not big enough or good enough, frankly, to get to the right answers in this transformation if they're not supported by private investment in a sensible way, if they're not driven by the brains that exist in the city, in how you could do things differently, and how innovation that's appeared at the cost of billions of pounds somewhere is applied in the Defence Act. It's that application piece that's missing. And if we were having this conversation the Second World War, it became normal. We just need to make it normal again.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say that, because there are many organizations on this call now, including our own, who have pretty well developed and long-standing programs with the military, particularly as people are coming out of the military, to give them career opportunities and so on. And I just wonder if there is another go around some of that and see how we are collectively leaning in to support the efforts that you're talking about, Sir Richard. Sir Richard, we've got a few minutes to go. I wonder if you wouldn't mind just changing gear. We haven't touched on the Middle East, and again, some of the reports coming out recently, particularly about what we're now starting to see across the Lebanese border, are particularly concerning. I wonder if you could give your kind of outlook of what may or may not play out in the coming months.
Yeah, so we've obviously been staring hard at Gaza since 7th of October last year, and I think most people are aghast at how that's unfolding for the people involved and what that means for tensions and security in the region. It's been really clear since the start that none of the major actors in the Middle East, so Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Qatar, none of those powers want to see the conflict spiral into a regional war. And so far that's been pretty successful. The problem is, because it's quite well understood that nobody wants a regional war, it has created like a zone of comfort in which people can poke each other quite hard, knowing no one wants to tip it over. But two things have become more dangerous. The first is in the context particularly of Israel, and we can all see how hard this is. More and more the red mist appears to have descended, where people have clearly been enraged by what happened, and as they've become enraged, their tolerance of their neighbors has reduced, and their willingness to contemplate fighting, even if they can't see where it really leads them, has reduced. And right now, as we begin to see the utility of force in Gaza beginning to run out, although not done yet, right now we are clearly looking at whether Israel is or is not tempted to go to war for the security of its northern border. And that will be a conflict on a scale way greater than Gaza. And with that will come much greater risk of the escalation everyone's trying to avoid. And the second thing is, and we talked about this right at the start, is this has become a feature of how Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are being forced together in a common response to a US-led support to Israel and Ukraine and others. And so whatever happens in Israel is providing a bit of the forcing function for the standoff between these two blocks. And I'm going to conclude all that saying is, you can fill the room with sensible policy analysts who will explain why this should not, need not, must not become a war. It's just a confrontation. But if you look at human history, we aren't very good at holding ourselves back when there's enough of a head of steam and the red mist descends. And that risk is greater now than it was a year ago.
Yeah, and Sir Richard is hoping that we can. You have covered an amazing range of topics. I am super grateful. I'm also very mindful that some of our colleagues could disappear off this call despondent and scared. I wonder if there is anything that you could do to cheer us up when you do an outlook. Are there scenarios that could play to a more peaceful and a softer landing than perhaps some of the things we've just been talking about?
Yes, not often asked that. But they are the reverse of the coin we've talked about. So in the context of just UK defence and the revitalisation of NATO, relatively modest but thoughtful and quite quick transformation of NATO, including UK defence, will reset that balance of deterrence with Russia and ensure that there isn't a war with Russia. And Russia knows that would be madness for Russia as well as everybody else if it does it. So small things make a big difference. And secondly, from the perspective of UK citizens and businesses, if we engage with the world as it's turning out in the way that we have talked about, if we make a point of standing up for ourselves in a sensible, intelligent, and thoughtful way, we can then have a conversation with people who don't agree with us, and we're much more likely to come to an accommodation because we've been thoughtful and and when necessary, sufficiently strong about it. The reverse is worse, where the rest of the world thinks we're in decline and we can just be shoved over. So really now is the time for leadership, for innovation, for some economic, financial and fiscal agility to get ourselves back on the front foot. And if we do that, we'll be securer, we'll be richer, and we'll definitely feel better about ourselves.
Well, I couldn't think of a better way of bringing this to a close. So allow me on behalf of all of the people on this call, Sir Richard, and all the work that you've done for us and you're about to do with the Strategic Defence Review, to thank you for the time you have spent with us. We wish you well for the Defence Review, and we look forward to welcoming you back once it's been published. And as we said to you at the outset, the City look forward to supporting this important work. And allow me to thank colleagues for joining and wishing you all a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you so much.